Thank you very much, Wes. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, good night, whatever part of the world you are. My name is Ignacio Alvarez. I am the co-chair of the Human Rights Interest Group at ASIL. This group is comprised by more than 750 members from all over the world. We share all interests in human rights. So it's a very unique and special group. And in that role as co-chair of this group, I would like to welcome Commissioner Mijatovic, I hope I'm pronouncing it well. It's a great honor that you accepted to be with us today, Commissioner. Thank you very much. We'll follow up afterwards with a letter saying thank you and inviting your staff, if part of your staff is not a member of ACID and our group, to join. It will be a great honor to have more people also from your office working with the Human Rights Group and with ACID. Having said that, I would like to introduce and to say thanks to Nani Jensen Revenflow for being our moderator. Nani is a very well-known human rights lawyer, and among her different interests and projects, one of them, if we have to identify one, he's a founder of Systemic Justice, a great NGO that works among other things on freedom of expression. So thank you very much. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Ignacio, for the kind introduction, and thank you everyone for joining us from across different time zones. So I will not commit to good evening or good morning or afternoon. It's my honor to introduce today's speaker, the Council of Europe Commissioner for Human Rights, Dunja Mijatovic. She has held this position since the 1st of April 2018. She's the fourth commissioner, but she has been working on promoting and protecting human rights for the past 2 decades. So she therefore has extensive knowledge in the field of international human rights monitoring, and in particular in the field of freedom of expression. Prior to her appointment as Commissioner for Human Rights, Ms. Mijatovic served as the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, a representative on freedom of the media, from 2010 to 2017. And we have the pleasure of working together in that capacity already. So I'm very pleased to be sharing the screen with you tonight, Dunja. She was director of broadcast of the Communications Regulatory Agency of Bosnia and Herzegovina from 2001 to 2010, chair of the European Platform of Regulatory Agencies from 2007 to 2017, and also chair of the Council of Europe's Group of Specialists on Freedom of Expression and Information in Times of Crisis from 2005 to 2007. Ms. Mijatovic regularly gives lectures in national and international fora, and she has been awarded several human rights prizes. And she's also been very active in supporting NGO activities in the field of human rights, education, and asylum. She will first address us for a brief period of time about some of the topics that are high on her radar, high on her agenda, after which we'll open the floor for questions. So I encourage everyone, if you have questions for the Commissioner, to please enter them in the Q&A so I can make sure that they get asked. Dunja, if I may hand over the microphone to you.
Thank you, Nani. Great pleasure to share the screen with you, even though I would prefer to see all of you in person. Nevertheless, this is a great opportunity also to reach out outside Europe and talk about human rights and the challenges in these challenging times. I'm really grateful for your invitation, and there are many things that I would like to share with you. Today, I will try to be focused on the major priorities in my work, and then, of course, to leave certain amount of time really to Nani and to all of you to be able to ask questions or to, you know, give your opinions about the time we live in. I can also say at the very beginning that I'm not a lawyer. Sometimes I say, unfortunately, I cannot imagine my life without lawyers. But most of the time, particularly lately, I'm saying I'm fortunate to be surrounded by a great lawyers and people really able to fix certain situations when there are grave violations of human rights. And this work, of course, cannot be imagined, and the job and the mandate without looking at the rule of law and the importance of judiciary and independent judiciary in our lives at any stage. So I think we are already at a stage, you know, in Europe or, you know, even beyond, to say that this is quite an unprecedented time. Particularly if we talk about human rights system in Europe. My institution is independent, non-judicial institution, and the mandate is to promote effective observance of human rights and awareness about them, and also to help Council of Europe member states, 47 member states, to improve human rights protection. And I'm also mandated to facilitate the activities of national human rights structures, and also I have a specific role in protection of human rights defenders. To do this, I have several tools at my disposal, all of democratic nature, country visits, contacts with a wide range of actors, and those visits are followed with detailed reports, recommendations to the governments. And outside these country visits, I'm also in constant dialogue with the authorities of member states, from exchanges of letters to participation in hearings, etc. When necessary, I also carry ad hoc missions, as I did last year, towards the end of last year, to the border region between Poland and Belarus. And I'm certain that many of you are aware about human rights crisis at this border that are continuing. I tried to focus on the situation of people that were stranded there. I will not talk in details about this, but if there are any particular questions in relation to this, of course, I will come back to it later. Under the European Convention on Human Rights, I can intervene as an amicus curiae before the European Court of Human Rights at my own initiative. And this is a tool I used extensively. Even now, in the second half of my 6 years mandate, I'm the commissioner who used this more than any other colleague before me. And I also can submit observation to the Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe when it's supervising the execution of the court's judgments. Well, this is, you know, in short, about the mandate that is quite unique in international system of human rights protection. Also, if you look at other international organizations, this uniqueness is really related to a full independence in decision-making for the person who is a commissioner at a certain time. And it gives you a freedom really to look at the issues that sometimes are extremely sensitive, controversial for the society in question or globally, which in a way is very good, and it proved during this pandemic that is important more than ever to preserve this independence. Since I took up the office in April 2018, Among many other subjects, I focus on the protection and promotion of the human rights of women, migrants, LGBTI persons, and persons with disabilities. And I also worked extensively on the protection of human rights in the context of artificial intelligence, also doing extremely important work with Nani, who was really a key expert in educating my team and helping us, in this struggle to introduce somehow a new topic for the institution, and it actually resulted in some very important documents and recommendations that we can also share with you during this talk, but also at a later stage. So you can already sense that the office is a flexible institution which can react to new problems as they occur. The pandemic and its consequences on human rights was a good example on this, as I already stated. But I also have to keep an eye on long-standing human rights issues, such as the respect for human rights in the fight against terrorism or threats to freedom of expression. A recurrent issue during my mandate has been threats to the rule of law, which I think is of interest to you in particular. And this issue related to the threats to the rule of law, which is a precondition for human rights. In my view, there can be no human rights without a solid checks and balances system, including an independent and impartial judiciary, but also active parliaments, strong and independent human rights structures, pluralist and professional media, and a vibrant civil society. All this sounds really great, and it is something that we would like to see in an ideal world, but unfortunately we do not live in an ideal world. So how we can really make an impact on all these issues is a big question mark for all of us working in a human rights protection system. I have observed worrying levels of regression across all these areas since the beginning of my tenure, both outside and within the EU member states. So as you know, 47 states, all EU member states, but also other member states, including Western Balkans, part of the world that I come from, but also Russia, South Caucasus, and Ukraine, and states that are not really part of the EU protection system. So the Council of Europe is a main human rights body in order to remind all about the importance of human rights protection. The independence and impartiality of the judiciary that I already mentioned is a particularly sensitive issue in many countries. I will briefly mention a few. In Turkey, for example, I have examined it in depth, concluding that the present situation represents an existential threat to the rule of law in Turkey. The same holds true for Russia, where the trial of Alexei Navalny defied all credibility and contravened Russia's international human rights obligations. But this is just one case, an emblematic case that I like to mention today. Within the EU, Hungary and Poland are the countries where I have raised pressing rule of law issues most often. And I have engaged with the parliaments and governments in both countries on many occasions, voiced by numerous and very serious concerns and issued recommendations. And unfortunately, the worrying trend is continuing in both countries, but it is not just these two countries, there is more coming, and there are more worrying trends when it comes to independent judiciary. Another worrying trend has been the pressure that NGOs and human rights defenders critical of the government are increasingly under in many member states. In Hungary, human rights defenders and civil society organizations have been subjected for years to smear campaigns and also targeted by legislation and other measures. In the Russian Federation, many face judicial harassment based on pieces of legislation targeting NGOs, and the most recent example of this was the threats against Memorial that I elaborated in several statements and also a letter to the General Prosecutor of Russian Federation. In Turkey, civil society organizations and human rights defenders also face enormous pressure. The case of Osman Kavala, that I'm sure you are familiar with, who is still detained on baseless charges, despite a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights, is a warning of the consequences of an undermined rule of law in the country. And I have also worked on undue restrictions on freedoms of expression and assembly in other countries, for example, in Spain, concerning the chilling effect of administrative sanctions in the context of public assemblies. In France, regarding the state's reaction to the Gilets jaunes, Yellow Vests movements. And combating dispersal of disinformation is also an issue that I would briefly like to mention. That, you know, the combating this dispersal of disinformation in many member states that may cause panic or social unrest to effectively fight a pandemic was also something that we observed. In some member states, including several countries from you know, the EU or the really, you know, real democracies, governments adopted decrees or decisions or orders that clearly risks hampering the work of journalists and media actors and restricting the public's right to receive information. Timely information is essential, particularly in times of crisis. Is essential for the public to understand the danger and to adopt measures at a really personal level to protect themselves. And those measures risked to undermine this important process. Another important issue I address relates to the protection and safety of journalists so that they are able to do their work under safe conditions without fear of being harassed or attacked, which unfortunately has happened to some journalists reporting on the pandemic. I urged the states, Council of Europe member states, to preserve press and media freedom and to ensure that measures to combat disinformation are necessary, proportionate, and subject to regular oversight, including by parliaments and national human rights institutions. Another source of concern are the attacks on journalists. The number of those who have been killed in connection with their reporting, particularly investigative journalists, has grown. As you know, several recent murders in recent years in several EU member states have shattered the illusion, I would say, that the EU was immune from such attacks. In a number of these cases, the authorities have failed to ensure independent and effective investigations. This is the case in Malta, for example, where more than 4 years after brutal, horrific murder, assassination of Daphne Caruana Galizia, the authorities still have not implemented the reforms necessary to protect journalists. On top of these long-standing problems, the COVID-19 pandemic has put an enormous strain on the democratic fabric of our society, on which protection of human rights ultimately depends. The death toll is huge. The economic insecurity is growing as we speak, and so is the distrust towards institutions. So we should not forget that the right to health is also a human right protected in international treaties. I have published a comprehensive document and recommendations to member states earlier this year on protecting this right. And in it, I set out 12 recommendations, for example, in relation to universal health coverage or a more equitable distribution of vaccines. The pandemic has also provided many governments with an ideal pretext to exploit fears and to crack down on dissent, restrict people's rights, and pass emergency legislation that risks having long-term consequences beyond the health crisis. Another trend that I would like to mention is the levels of inequality. The levels of inequality, fear, and polarization in our societies. Structural discrimination, in a way, keeps millions of Europeans on the margins of our societies. For example, in employment, health, education, housing, and the criminal justice system. The current pandemic magnified existing inequalities in Europe and beyond, I'm sure. Those who were poor before became poorer. Those who were disadvantaged faced even greater disadvantages. And inequalities affecting women, LGBTI people, and ethnic minorities illustrate this problem well. Although the situation varies from country to country, discriminatory treatment of women is everywhere. In the workplace, in manifestation of violence and the obstacles faced by women in accessing sexual and reproductive health and rights. We cannot talk about this topic without recognizing tremendous achievements in the past decades when it comes to women's rights or LGBTI rights. But what we are facing nowadays in Europe is extremely worrying, because this regression is really rapidly going down, and it's really visible if you think of everything that is happening in many Council of Europe member states. And here I'm not talking based on some theories or only statistics. It is based on pure facts. And my talks with many during my field missions, also during pandemic time, going to shelters, going to family planning clinics, and many places where I hear very concerned voices that do not want to be silenced in this extremely difficult period. Progress on ensuring equality for LGBTI people has been remarkable in some countries in recent years. And in many others, like Armenia, Azerbaijan, Hungary, Poland, Turkey, Russia, countries of the Western Balkans, the trend is very worrying. The situation is not much better for people with ethnic minority and immigrant backgrounds. People of African descent face widespread discrimination in all areas of life and are far more likely to be stopped by the police without reasonable suspicion. And there are some forthcoming projects and papers that my office is preparing for exactly those reasons and issues that we were made aware during my country visits and also roundtables with human rights defenders. Hate incidents also continue to affect Jews, Muslims, and Roma, who are among the preferred scapegoats of groups propagating hatred, and the rise of anti-Semitism and Islamophobia are a concern throughout Europe. There are also issues related to data protection concerns, and I will just briefly mention the topic that has been widely discussed in several member states, concerns the use of digital devices to help enforce quarantine orders, track the progression of infections or inform people about their possible exposure to infected individual, and the processing of personal data in this context. So all of this is something that we are very much aware of in Europe. It is widely used, but in opinion editorial that I published last year, I cautioned against the data protection risks that such tools would entail. And I also recommended a number of steps for member states to ensure that such tools are introduced only if they are designed and also used in a way that respect democratic rules. Finally, I would like to mention an issue that is extremely important in my mandate, and it is related to migration. And the position of Europe as a continent towards migration. Many Council of Europe member states are at the forefront of another major human rights challenge facing Europe at the moment, and this is actually the protection of the human rights of refugees, asylum seekers, and migrants. This is an area which took up an enormous amount of time since I started this job. I'm deeply concerned about the backsliding on the right to seek asylum due to the currently prevailing focus in Europe on deterrence and preventing arrivals, and lack of sufficient European and global responsibility sharing. Poorer countries that are hosting large numbers of refugees are seeing richer European countries turning away completely from their obligations. This fundamentally threatens the global system of protection that is already shaken. And this system cannot function if member states do not hold each other to account for failing to meet their obligations. So those important conventions, Refugee Convention, all the resolutions that we have at our disposal are not just words on paper. They need to be implemented, particularly in times of crisis. By actively supporting or silently condoning non-compliant practices like the ones I have recently observed at the border of Poland and Belarus, member states are increasingly sending the signal that violations are acceptable, parts of migration control. Pushbacks are becoming widespread, undermining the international protection system. I have examined this issue in detail in several publications on rescuing migrants at sea, and I intend to devote more attention to it in the coming months. I'm also extremely troubled by the tendency to outsource migration management to countries with disastrous human rights records. Here I'm of course thinking of Libya. The founding principles and values on which the Council of Europe and modern European democracies have been built are as relevant today as ever before, and they equip national authorities with the tools that they need to become defenders of human rights, for which they need the solidarity of other states to work out common solutions to common problems. And here, in my view, multilateralism is a key word here. No single country can solve complex human rights and security challenges on their own. And the topics I mentioned above are non-exhaustive picture of the interconnected challenges that are preventing millions of people from fully enjoying their human rights in Europe. The lessons are clear. We can no longer afford to delay the realization of human rights for all and need for a, I would call it, a renewed impetus. There is no easy fix, as we know, but taking the decisions, bold, courageous decisions to address these long-standing problems is a good start. And that is why I'm all the time calling for more presence of leaders that are courageous enough with the wisdom in order to address these issues until it is really time to do this, because what we are seeing now that many member states are targeting migrants in order to win votes, which is something extremely dangerous for any democratic society. But at the same time, not to be too pessimistic, I also see many reasons for hope. Most member states are still, by and large, holding true to their commitments to human rights and their international obligations. Also the work with young people and many other things that I can mention maybe later on. In general, at the end, I know and I feel strongly that there are still sufficient antibodies in our societies that can help us move forward and keep Europe and the world as a home of freedom, justice, and human dignity. The most important issue is not to give up or to give in, which is something I can assure you, at least my office will not do. Thank you very much for the opportunity, and I'm looking forward to our discussions and, of course, any questions you might have.
Thank you so much, Dunja, for this wonderful overview. And I already have some questions from the audience, but just as a reminder to prompt anyone who wants to ask a question to the Commissioner to enter it into the Q&A. Maybe before I move to the questions that were put in the Q&A box, are there some examples of positive developments that you are particularly pleased about since you entered into the mandate? We obviously have a lot of challenges ahead of us, and I always like to kind of like joke that you have to be a realistic optimist in order to engage in human rights work. But what are the things that give you hope that you have seen over the past years that you think are positive developments to mention today?
Yeah, you're right, Nani. This work cannot be done if you're not an optimist. At the same time, you need to be very realistic in order to tackle issues, but optimism and hope is extremely important, because you also have to give hope and energy to others, particularly to the most vulnerable ones, to be a voice to voiceless. And then, when you see that you have an impact and that you can save or help even one individual, this remains, the most important thing, at least for me and my team, in order to push forward. But if you look at, what's happening in member states, there are achievements. What I would like to mention as one extremely important change is civil society being more active than ever before. People voicing their concerns, their disagreements, and here we come to youth, to young people, which is the most important movement that I could see. It's of course related mainly to the environment and protection of when it comes to climate change. Their courage, their determination is something that we need to support. We need to give them a platform to express themselves, to be listened to seriously. And I think this is already happening. This is seen in many parts of Europe and the world. And what I also see as important is to protect human rights defenders, defending environment, because they are increasingly under attacks in many Council of Europe member states, which is quite a new thing for Europe. If you look at the situation 5 years ago, this was not the case. But now there are extremely important partner that also gives hope that they will not give up, because they do ask us for more, not less human rights. But there is also something that we need to, when I say we, I'm thinking about international organizations, we need to take a long, hard look, in the mirror in order to see what has been done wrongly, why there is so much opposition to human rights, and why suddenly human rights are at the margins of any discussions for the well-being of the society. So I think, youth, but also some movements in member states. I would single out the latest trials in Germany in relation to war crimes in Syria, which is something quite new, but it is also related to universal jurisdiction that shows that there are avenues to render justice, and that this could be applied to prosecute returnees, for example, ISIS returnees, which is another file that I'm working on, if there is a willingness and political will to tackle these issues in proper way. So there are many examples. Also, there are states that are following our recommendations. I can also mention the cases in Slovakia and Czech Republic, where finally, after decades of struggle, Roma women that were sterilized in the 90s received compensations, and more importantly, the apologies from the state. So there are good examples. Those are drops, but very important drops in order to move forward.
Thank you very much. The questions are coming in very rapidly in the meantime, so I have my own, but I will politely give up the microphone to the audience. There are a couple of questions that look at the consequences for states when they violate human rights. There's one member of the audience that's asking what the consequences are for states that violate their human rights obligations or defy a judgment of the European Court of Human Rights. And then there's a related question basically asking what we actually can do when government officials lie when they are confronted with evidence of human rights violations. And the migration context is particularly mentioned there when it comes to turnbacks of refugees and asylum seekers. Can you say something about that?
There are different tools of really holding states accountable. I mentioned during my introduction that all my tools are of democratic nature, so I don't have a possibility to sanction states or anything even close to this, and I think it should be that way. I mean, it shouldn't be other way around, because I do not think that would be a proper way of addressing these things. But politically, Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe can start an infringement procedure. If the states are not complying with their obligations, if they are not executing judgments of the European Court of Human Rights. At a moment before Committee of Ministers of the Council of Europe is a very important case that I mentioned, Osman Kavala, and the refusal of Turkey to implement the judgment and to release Osman Kavala from prison. There are many other cases. In the past, there was a case of Ilgar Mammadov from Azerbaijan, who was finally released. So the procedure did not follow the infringement procedure. But when it comes to states not telling the truth, the important thing is to listen to arguments. I need to engage with the states, but then what I publish in my reports and in my assessments is actually my assessment in relation to certain issues related to migration. For example, if the state, doesn't matter which state, is denying that there are exercising pushbacks at the border. Of course, I also talk to NGOs, to international organizations that are present in the field before I publish my recommendations and my analysis of the situation. And then this can also be used by the court. I can then also go before the court and submit third-party intervention with my observations, and then of course it is up to the court to make a decision in relation to particular issues. But you know that those are the ways to deal with this. But the important thing is to check, double check, triple check before we publish something that can in a way undermine the image of the country, which many governments are very sensitive to this, and publish information that is not accurate, which is actually the last thing we want to do. We do it in good faith. We criticize, I do criticize governments. Most of the time they do not like it. No governments like to be criticized, but that's, you know, part of the mandate, and actually doing it is helping and assisting states, and also sending a signal that we do monitor, and being member of family or international organization is something that should be honored, first of all by respecting the rules and not to mention the values of the organizations. At the moment, we are in a very difficult time when it comes to these issues. There is a lot of opposition, a lot of misinterpretation, shifting away from the basic values. And that's why we need to be even more cautious and more active in defending rights in member states. We do owe it to the population, to people living in Europe, and that is what we will continue to do.
Yeah, I have a follow-up question that also comes from the questions that the audience has been putting in the Q&A, and that's how you appeal to states. You just said no state likes to be criticized. But what do you rely on? Do you appeal to law? Do you appeal to morality? Both? And it's kind of tied into another question that was asked, which is like, why are we seeing a regression in the state of human rights? Like, is naming and shaming no longer working? Are there any other things that you factor into that? What is your analysis of that situation?
In a way, opposing this sort of notion that comes from many politicians, I would say, saying that, you know, naming and shaming doesn't work. We should only engage in quiet diplomacy. Quiet diplomacy is an extremely important tool in relation to human rights issues, particularly if we address safety of people that are defending rights in member states. And personally, I try to engage with member states using quiet diplomacy, not making issues public, in order to see some substantial changes. But sometimes, you know, not being loud and clear and using actually the most powerful tool that I have in my toolbox, and that's my voice, in addressing human rights issues would be a big failure. Many would be happy to see a very silent commissioner, which I do not think is a way to deal with this, because we have enough political institutions or politicians to use quiet diplomacy. When it comes to human rights and grave human rights violations, after repeated you know, calls for changes, I think we also need to call things the way they are and to expose those violations. And when it comes to my own strategy or procedures in dealing with it, really depends on topic. If it is related to a certain law, if it is related to a particular person that is in danger. So I do call most of the time, and I do rely on the European Convention on Human Rights, which is the most important document, but also numerous resolutions of the Committee of Ministers and many other legal tools that I have at my disposal. But sometimes it's just a statement reminding states of their failure. I mean, just a few days ago, it was in relation to a referendum in Hungary that will be held the same day as the elections in April, asking citizens about sexuality education of children. But what is, if you scratch it, what the government is actually doing is trying to equate pedophilia with homosexuality. And that has an enormous negative effect towards not only LGBTI community, but society as a whole in a democratic country. So I made a statement about this because, there is nothing much to discuss after numerous letters and calls not to adopt these kind of laws that are undermining a particular group in the society. So it really depends. What I'm addressing in order to see together with my team. I work with a team of 25 to 30 people, depending on the time, in order to address Council of Europe member states. It is very challenging to cover it, so we really need to carefully choose the priorities and look at the issues that are really visible human rights violations affecting people's life. So it is also up to the commissioner to, first of all, protect the legacy of the previous commissioners, but then also at the same time to make sure that you have your own view on the current human rights situation in order to be able to address it.
Thank you very much. Jumping to the topic of journalism, you already touched upon it in your address, and of course you worked exclusively on the topic of freedom of expression and on the media during your time at the OSCE. One member of the audience wants to know what you think the challenges are and also positive developments that journalists will face in 2022.
We work closely with journalists, bloggers, activists, also human rights defenders and NGOs defending journalism, which are also important part of this club. And we hear, different stories from them in information. In many states, they have huge problems in really accessing information. So access to information is one of the biggest challenges that I think it's a result of the pandemic and new rules that are introduced, but not only pandemic, also a previous time when proper access to information laws were not fully implemented. So they are struggling a lot to get accurate information in order to report. And then, of course, they are facing problems because of limitations of the right to assembly in many member states. Safety of journalists I already mentioned, and I will not elaborate more on that on this. But what I think is positive thing is solidarity that is present more than ever before. And it is not only related to the really important global NGOs defending freedom of expression and media freedom, but it is also related to individual journalists that are working across the region in order really to be able to do their job freely and safely. So this is something that I think is a new sort of thing because it's more visible than ever before. And they're also using more secure tools in order to secure themselves. And here I'm thinking about online world that is more present than any other way of communicating currently. So I think they are more careful in securing their information and protecting colleagues in some states that are not that friendly to journalists. So I think, you know, lessons are learned in the previous decade, I would say. So there are many positive developments in relation to this. And even with all these problems, we still have people that are eager to do hardcore investigative journalism, exposing crime, corruption, and all these things that can improve a well-being of our societies, which I think deserves you know, a tribute from all of us, but also, you know, for the work I'm doing, more focus on protecting and making it possible for them to do their important work. An eye-opener, I would say, for a very difficult and challenging time.
Thank you very much. In your address, you referred to the situation of a number of marginalized groups and communities, which makes one think also about the Council of Europe institutions themselves, which generally do not represent these groups in an adequate way. Overall, many of these institutions are still predominantly white, predominantly male, able-bodied, etc. How can we get to a point where our international human rights institutions are more representative of our societies?
This is a huge challenge. We still have a very long way to go. There were many improvements, but those improvements were mainly in legislation. So this is also something that I call ticking the box, but actually not doing much or not doing anything in order really to show the diversity of our societies. This is something that we try to address on almost all occasions. Traveling to member states, but also in all my public speeches, I'm trying to, you know, talk about these problems. I was very active on this particular issue in the Western Balkans, in my home country, Bosnia and Herzegovina. That is very, you know, that there is such a, you know, disproportionate distribution of posts, and you know, if you look at the government or the institutions, but this is not just in relation to men and women. It's a real full diversity of the society, which unfortunately is not visible. So I can only say that we will try to cover this, and we are trying to cover this from the human rights point of view. But even though we hear many positive speeches and positive news, I think visibility is something that can be a good answer. And if you look at certain events or certain introductions of the institutions of international organizations, then you see that we are far away from a true and genuine introduction of the diversity of our societies.
Thank you very much. Going to follow up with a very specific question from a member of the audience about an intervention in a European court case from your office, in the case of Camano Valle versus Spain, which involved voting restrictions on persons with disabilities who were subject to guardianship orders. And the question is basically that they would love to hear your thoughts on the voting rights of persons with disabilities more generally, but specifically in the context of this case.
Yeah, in the context of this case, I can only say that I was disappointed with the decision. My view in my submission before the court was very clear. And also, you know, my observations that are still public. I still have the same opinion, and I will try to, you know, and I will continue raising it, because the file or a portfolio on the issues related to the rights of people with disabilities is very high on my agenda. So not only on voting rights, but in general. So I will continue raising these things, but the situation is extremely complex. There are very different views, particularly when it comes to mental health, deinstitutionalization. Many, doctors are of different opinions, but I'm glad that we have CRPD and that we have many other instruments in order to start pushing for liberalization and the full enjoyment of human rights of people with disabilities, to fight stereotypes, prejudice, and to make them part of our societies. So as I said, it's an extremely difficult issue, but I will try not only using third-party interventions, but also any other possibility, and also working with other international organizations in order to tackle these issues.
Thank you so much. We are approaching the end of our session. I would like to invite you to share a few parting words with us all before we say goodbye.
Well, I can just, thank you for the opportunity. Also hope for some new possibilities to continue discussion on very important issues, not only in Europe, but beyond. We should never stay and live in bubble. We should always think what's happening outside our comfort zone in order to be successful in defending human rights. I can say that these last 2 years were extremely challenging for me as a person and also for my team. Nobody expected that we will have to defend human rights during the time of pandemic, but I think we managed, and we will continue pushing. We are grateful for the interest, for the criticism, for knowledge of others in order to be able to push forward. And on this, as I already stated, we should never give up or give in this belief that human rights for all is something that we have to build our societies on. And I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have this honorable position to do this. And as I said at the beginning, even the smallest impact or just helping one person can make the world go round. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Commissioner, for your address and for so openly answering all of our questions, and also for these encouraging words at the end. Thank you, everyone who joined us today. I assume a recording will be made available for anyone who would like to view this again later. Thank you all for your time, for your great questions. And again, Commissioner, thank you very much for joining us today.
Warm greetings from Strasbourg to all.